It was the dead of night, the kind of silence that could make you hear your heartbeat.
Clear the area. Stay back.
August 21st, 2013, marked a night that would forever change Omaha. Under the pale light of a dim street lamp, Andrea Krueger, a 33-year-old mother of 3, drove home after a long shift at Deja Vu Lounge. The city felt still, deceptively peaceful, but lurking in the shadows was a predator whose actions would soon shatter the calm. Nikko Jenkins, just days out of prison, was no longer the man who had once shown signs of redemption. He had become something much darker, a man driven not by remorse, but by an insatiable thirst for blood. In the early hours, he and his crew, his sister Erica, cousin Christine Bordeaux, and another accomplice, spotted Andrea's SUV at a stoplight. Their eyes locked onto her, watching, waiting. Andrea was unknowingly caught in their sights, the target of a violent predator who was poised to strike. The world around them was muffled in the stillness of the night as Jenkins watched Krueger's every move. To him, she wasn't a mother, a woman, or a person, she was just another pawn in his twisted game. Without a word, without a second of hesitation, Jenkins sprang into action. They blocked her path, forcing her off the road. In an instant, the quiet night exploded into chaos. Andrea, bewildered and frightened, must have felt the icy grip of fear clutch at her heart as Jenkins dragged her from her SUV. Her mind must have raced, but there was no escaping the nightmare that was unfolding. As she struggled, her cries for mercy were drowned out by the deafening sound of Jenkins' shotgun being raised. There was no warning. No chance to fight back. Just the split-second crack of the shotgun, and Andrea's life was violently snatched away. The blast tore into her face and neck, a grotesque and brutal end to a life filled with love and responsibility. In the stillness that followed, Andrea's body collapsed to the pavement. Blood pooled around her, her once vibrant life extinguished in an instant. Her 3 children, waiting at home, would never see their mother again. The world they once knew would be forever marked by the horror of that night. Jenkins, unfazed by the chaos, didn't even spare a moment to look back at the destruction he'd caused. He turned and fled, his crew speeding away in the stolen SUV as though nothing had happened. For them, it was just another kill, just another robbery gone wrong. But for the family of Andrea Krueger, the horror was just beginning. And for Jenkins, this was only the beginning. To understand how Nikko Jenkins arrived at the cold, blood-soaked streets of Omaha on that fateful night, we need to go back to where it all began. His story wasn't one of innocence or redemption, but of a mind cracked by abuse, neglect, and the brutal hand of a world that seemed to offer nothing but chaos. Nikko was born on September 16, 1986, in Colorado, to parents who would never be able to provide the stability or love a child needs. His father, David A. Hamaji, had been part of the respected Levering family, known for their fight for Native American land rights. But by the time Nikko was born, that legacy had crumbled into nothing more than whispers of a past long gone. His parents were addicts, lost in a world of drugs and violence, a toxic environment that would shape Nikko's every step. As a child, Nikko's life was one of constant turmoil. His home was a battlefield, his parents constantly fought, their volatile relationship creating a toxic atmosphere of fear and confusion. His mother, Lori Jenkins, was consumed by addiction, and his father wasn't much better. David was often in and out of jail for various offenses, including assault and threats. Their relationship was a dangerous one, marked by physical altercations that Nikko had no choice but to witness. From a young age, he was exposed to the raw violence and rage that would later define his life. Money was always tight, and the family scraped by in a rundown neighborhood, where gangs ruled the streets and survival wasn't a guarantee. In places like this, children often learned how to fend for themselves, and Nikko was no different. He grew up in a world where violence was normalized, where the concept of family was distorted, and where self-preservation often meant turning a blind eye to anything that wasn't pure survival. By the age of 7, Nikko's behavior began to reflect the chaos around him. He was caught bringing his mother's loaded handgun to Highland Elementary School, a small, powerful sign of the darkness creeping into his life. A 7-year-old with a loaded weapon in his backpack wasn't the product of a healthy childhood. It was the result of a world where fear and violence became as familiar as breathing. The problems didn't stop there. At 8, Nikko was hospitalized for cutting himself, a sign of the emotional pain he couldn't express. Doctors recognized early signs of mental instability, ADHD, they suspected, but the cracks ran deeper. His parents were too lost in their own world to focus on getting Nikko the help he needed. The mental health system failed him, the system that should have caught the early warning signs, just as it would fail him again and again in the years to come. By the time Nikko was 11, he had been in and out of foster care and group homes, each new environment seemingly no better than the last. The violence he had been born into followed him like a shadow, always lurking just below the surface. At one point, he was expelled from a group home for constant fights, his fists a reflection of the anger and confusion boiling inside him. School was a distant memory by this point. The education system couldn't reach him, his classmates couldn't either. He had already traded his books for the street corners, where petty theft and gang activity had become his reality. But what truly marked the beginning of his downward spiral came at 15, when Nikko grabbed a knife and committed his first assault. It was a warm July evening in 2001 when Nikko and 2 accomplices targeted a man in Omaha. They robbed him, but it didn't stop there. When the victim handed over his car keys, Nikko slashed at him, leaving deep cuts on the man's body. The victim survived, but Nikko's hunger for violence had been awakened. He was caught hours later, and despite his young age, he faced adult charges for the robbery and assault. The court saw him for what he was, a young man already far removed from the possibility of redemption. He was sentenced and sent to juvenile detention, but this wasn't going to be a place of rehabilitation. This was a precursor to the monster he would become. Inside the juvenile detention facility, Nikko fought with anyone and everyone. Guards. Fellow inmates. He was unmanageable. His violence was a reflection of the chaos in his life. His rage could not be contained, and it continued to fester as he served his time. The path to destruction was already set in motion. The system had failed him, and in return, he was learning to feed off that failure. The anger built within him as he faced years of institutionalization, and there, in the dark corners of confinement, his mind began to unravel further. He was eventually released, but by the time Nikko was 16, he was already a hardened criminal. His violent tendencies had become ingrained, and with a world of crime surrounding him, there was no reason to change. He didn't want to. The streets had become his home, the gangs his family, and violence his only means of expression. Jenkins' descent into pure chaos didn't stop there. He would continue to spiral deeper into a life of crime, each event worse than the last. But even as he walked through the door of a prison in 2003, the real nightmare, his transformation into a killer, was only just beginning. As the years passed in the Nebraska State Penitentiary, Nikko Jenkins' transformation from a troubled youth to a violent criminal took its darkest turn. The prison walls, which were meant to reform him, instead became the very crucible that forged his descent into madness. His early days behind bars weren't just marked by criminal acts, they were consumed by rage, defiance, and an escalating mental breakdown that went largely unnoticed. From the moment Jenkins arrived, he wasn't just another inmate. He was a problem. His aggressive nature quickly escalated, and soon, his time inside the prison became a violent blur. Jenkins racked up over 100 disciplinary infractions for fighting with guards, other prisoners, and destroying prison property. His behavior was unpredictable, a violent storm that no one seemed able to quell. At every turn, he resisted any effort to reform, choosing instead to drown in his own chaos. Solitary confinement became a routine. For years, Jenkins was placed in isolation, his days spent in a small concrete cell, where the only sounds were the clanging of steel doors and the muted voices of guards who grew weary of him. For 23 hours a day, Jenkins was left alone with his thoughts, a toxic mix of paranoia, anger, and delusion. Prison psychologists and staff, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of inmates and the lack of resources, struggled to diagnose him properly. His mental state was deteriorating, but no one was listening. He began hearing voices, delusions of grandeur that seemed to take over his mind. Jenkins would later claim that the voices were from Apis, an Egyptian serpent god, who demanded human sacrifices. Whether these were the ravings of a severely disturbed mind or a calculated act to manipulate those around him remains uncertain, but one thing was clear: his mind was unraveling. During his time in solitary, Jenkins scrawled cryptic symbols on his body and face. Tattoos of snakes and ancient hieroglyphs, which he claimed were tributes to Apis, covered his skin. He became obsessed with the idea that he was destined to fulfill the serpent god's demands, believing that killing was part of some divine purpose. The transformation was complete. Nikko Jenkins was no longer just a criminal. He was a man consumed by his own warped belief system. Despite the troubling signs, Jenkins was released from prison in 2013, just a decade after being locked away. The release should have been an opportunity for a new life, a chance to reintegrate into society. But for Jenkins, it was the beginning of a blood-soaked rampage. In the months leading up to his release, Jenkins had shown no remorse for his past actions. He had written letters begging for psychiatric help, but his pleas went unanswered. The prison system had failed him. The professionals, who were meant to intervene, had let him slip through the cracks. Jenkins wasn't rehabilitated. He wasn't even close. What emerged from those prison walls wasn't a man who had found peace or clarity, it was a ticking time bomb ready to explode. His release was a dangerous gamble, one that would prove fatal to several innocent lives. Within days of his freedom, Jenkins began plotting. This wasn't the man who had been locked away for 10 years, this was a monster, a figure warped by years of neglect and untreated mental illness. He had no plan for a fresh start, he had only one goal: to satisfy the voice of Apis, to fulfill the twisted destiny he had convinced himself was his. Pause and reflect. Imagine being released after years of incarceration, with the world expecting you to change. But for someone like Jenkins, change was never on the table. His mind had already been claimed by the darkness. And what happens when someone like Jenkins steps back into the world? It was just days after his release that the first murder occurred. But before we continue, think for a moment, could this tragedy have been prevented? Was there a chance to save Jenkins from himself, or was he destined to walk this dark path from the start? If you think the justice system failed Jenkins, or if you're shocked by what happened next, hit the like button and leave a comment below. Do you believe that someone like Jenkins could have been helped? Or was this inevitable? In the early hours of August 11, 2013, just 12 days after his release, Nikko Jenkins began his descent into pure madness. The streets of Omaha, once a place where he had roamed freely as a young criminal, now became the backdrop for a series of horrific murders. He wasn't just living in the world anymore, he was hunting, and the victims would be nothing more than pawns in his twisted game. Jenkins, along with his sister Erica, cousin Christine Bordeaux, and another accomplice, lured two men, Jorge Cajiga-Ruiz, 29, and Juan Uribe-Pena, 26, into a secluded park in South Omaha. They had planned it carefully, pretending to offer a sexual encounter arranged by Christine, a trap that would later seal the fate of these innocent men. Ruiz and Uribe-Pena, unaware of the danger ahead, followed the promise of a good time into the park's dark corners. What happened next was nothing short of brutal. The moment they were alone in the park, Jenkins ambushed them, armed with a 12-gauge shotgun. The weight of the weapon seemed to match the weight of Jenkins' growing paranoia, and his intent was clear: these men would not be leaving that park alive. With cold precision, he ordered them to the ground, taking their cash and belongings. But that wasn't enough. For Jenkins, this was no ordinary robbery, it was the start of something darker. He raised the shotgun, the cold steel gleaming under the dim light of the night. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger, blasting both men at point-blank range. The roar of the shotgun echoed in the stillness of the park as both men fell to the ground, their lives extinguished in an instant. Blood pooled beneath them, staining the earth, as Jenkins stood over them, unmoved by the carnage he had just unleashed. The brutality of the attack was chilling. Jenkins didn't show fear, remorse, or even regret, he showed nothing. This wasn't a man overcome by the weight of his actions. This was a killer, detached from humanity, driven by a belief in chaos and sacrifice. After the murder, Jenkins didn't flee into the night out of fear, he didn't hide. He acted like he was entitled to take these lives. He left the scene with his accomplices, as though it were just another night. They didn't need to rush. The lives they'd stolen didn't matter to them. But their actions didn't go unnoticed. The city of Omaha, once calm, was now filled with a rising fear. The police had no leads, and the public had no idea that the city's newest predator was already planning his next attack. What had begun as a random act of violence now escalated into something much worse, something with a chilling pattern that could only mean one thing: more victims were on the way. Jenkins wasn't done yet. The terror that had been unleashed was only the beginning. Less than a week after the first murders, Jenkins would strike again. But as we dig deeper into his deadly rampage, the question lingers: what drives a person to take the lives of others without any remorse? Pause and think for a moment: how could someone take lives so easily? How could they justify this kind of brutality? Share your thoughts below. Do you think Jenkins had a choice, or was he completely consumed by his delusions? Hit the like button if you think this case sheds light on the dark side of mental health and criminal justice. Subscribe for more in-depth analysis of cases like this, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a chilling story like this one. August 21, 2013. Just 10 days after Jenkins' first brutal murders, his violent spree continued with chilling precision. This time, his victim was Andrea Krueger, a 33-year-old mother of 3, whose life was taken in front of her children, forever altering the course of her family's future. Nikko Jenkins and his accomplices were no longer just committing random acts of violence, they were methodical, almost ritualistic in their killings. This time, they didn't just target an innocent bystander. They were hunting for something else, something more tangible. The plan was clear: take what they could, leave nothing behind but destruction. Andrea had no idea what was about to happen when she drove her white Chevrolet Traverse home after her shift. As she stopped at a light near 168th and 4th Streets, Jenkins and his crew saw their next opportunity. They forced her to pull over, under some fabricated pretense, and in that moment, Andrea's fate was sealed. It was a terrifying sight for her, alone, vulnerable, and with her 3 children waiting for her return. Jenkins dragged Andrea from the car, the shock of the situation no doubt overwhelming. Before she could fully comprehend what was happening, Jenkins raised his shotgun. With one sickening blast, he tore into Andrea's body, blowing apart her face and neck. The brutality of it was grotesque. Her life was stolen in an instant. Her children, left alone in the vehicle, would never see their mother again. The pain they felt that night would be something they carried with them for the rest of their lives. They were left in a world forever altered, with no closure or understanding of why their mother had to die. Jenkins and his accomplices didn't care. They were indifferent to the families they shattered, the children they left behind. After the murder, Jenkins and his crew made a hasty getaway, once again leaving a trail of blood and broken lives in their wake. They stole Andrea's vehicle, but that too, would lead the police right to them. What they didn't know was that their every move was being watched. The police were closing in, and the investigation was intensifying. Surveillance footage, witness statements, and tips from the public started to point towards Jenkins. He wasn't trying to hide, he was too arrogant, too confident in his ability to outsmart everyone. As his killing spree continued, the sense of fear in the city grew. People began to realize the horror they were dealing with. But it wasn't until August 29, 2013, that the police would finally catch up with Jenkins. It wasn't for the murders, though. At first, the police raided a house where Jenkins was holed up for a completely different charge, making terroristic threats. But in the chaos of the raid, the police uncovered a crucial piece of evidence: a 12-gauge shotgun still warm from the murders of Krueger, Ruiz, and Bradford. The weapon matched the shell casings at the crime scenes, tying Jenkins to the killings. What followed was a swift downfall. Jenkins was arrested, but even in custody, he wasn't showing remorse. Instead, he bragged about the murders, speaking about his supposed god, Apophis, and his sacrifices. He seemed to revel in the chaos, even as the noose tightened around him. His behavior was erratic, his mind a maze of delusions, but the evidence was overwhelming. Pause for a moment. Do you think Jenkins was aware of the true extent of his actions? Or was he so consumed by his delusions that he lost all sense of reality? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and hit the like button if you believe the system failed to intervene before this carnage could have been stopped. The chilling reality of this case is a reminder of the importance of early intervention in mental health issues. Jenkins, now in custody, faced a trail of charges that seemed endless. But even as the case unfolded, there were questions left unanswered. Could this entire spree have been avoided? Was Jenkins always doomed to this fate, or was his mental health simply too broken to fix? Subscribe for more in-depth looks into criminal cases and true crime stories like this one. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss another gripping story.